So for me, this was the opportunity to do a show about a family, but they also happen to be monsters. So that was one of the things that I thought was so important to this reimagining, is to be able to see the monsters in a way where they're actually functioning as monsters. Because in the original, they were a family that looked like monsters, but they didn't behave like monsters. And for us, they look less like monsters, but they behave more like monsters.
I just can't understand it.
Much like the body parts used to assemble Herman, the Munsters franchise has been dug up and reanimated more times than any other 60s sitcom, except maybe The Addams Family. But at least most of those Addams Family projects have been varied fresh takes on the characters, whereas almost every Munsters remake, reboot, or sequel seemed to fundamentally misunderstand what the original show was all about.
Well, that's showbiz.
Trust me, I know, as covering Munsters media has sort of become an annual tradition for this channel. As I've said in previous videos on the topic, the Munsters are trickier to adapt than the Addams Family, as those characters are based on drawings by Charles Addams, therefore opening up the opportunities for new interpretations through each film or TV project. The Munsters, however, have always been rooted in the performances of the original cast, and subsequent adaptations always had to live up to those very specific portrayals.
It's a terrible thing to do. It's downright murder.
Which is why I was always intrigued by Mockingbird Lane. Arriving during the boom of network TV shows that featured dark takes on whimsical characters, Mockingbird Lane was NBC's attempt at reimagining the Munster family with a darker edge.
Don't turn the neighbors into your blood slaves.
So you came all the way out here just to complain about helpful neighbors?
From the time it was announced to the airing of its pilot, the project was met with skepticism from Munsters fans, who were put off by the "this is not your father's Munsters" approach. But when you consider how stunningly bad some of the previous attempts to recreate the characters had been...
We're the monsters! We're the monsters!
Rotten.
Mockingbird Lane was at least inspired in concept, even if it didn't quite land the execution.
That is exactly the kind of shame I do not want coming out of your mouth.
Its first and only produced episode aired 12 years ago this month, and with yet another dark reimagining on the way, I wanted to finally revisit this show, to examine what it got right, as well as what it got wrong. News first broke of this new iteration of the Munsters in September 2010, when it was reported that Brian Fuller would be remaking the show, with potential involvement from Guillermo del Toro, who never ended up being credited in any official capacity, though his frequent collaborator, Guillermo Navarro, was hired as cinematographer. Prior to this, Fuller had created 3 short-lived yet fondly remembered dark fantasy shows. All 3 sitcoms were praised by critics and audiences at the time, but their respective networks, Showtime, Fox, and ABC, refused to allow any of them time to grow their audience, canceling all in under 2 seasons. Fuller was then lured to NBC by his longtime friend and then head of drama development for the network, Katie O'Connell. Fuller pitched the network 2 modern reimaginings of classic horror characters. The first, Hannibal Lecter. The second, The Munsters.
It was because there's so much worry and concern about remakes and all of the baggage that comes with them, they were initially very resistant to having me redo the Munsters as Mockingbird Lane.
By 2010, the Munsters had become a dead brand for the studio. In the early 2000s, the Wayans brothers had signed a deal to make a new Munsters film at Universal, though it ultimately fell apart.
We can all be thankful that will never happen.
Beyond that, the last appearance of the characters had been in the TV film The Munsters' Scary Little Christmas in 1996. Little is known about Fuller's initial pitch for the series, but it was reportedly somewhat different than what the show ended up being.
I approached Universal and I sort of slalomed through 3 regime changes at NBC with this project, and every time there was a regime change, the project just sort of adjusted a little bit.
NBC initially passed on his pitch.
As they say in Hollywood, it just doesn't grab me.
And Fuller set about reworking the idea to appeal more to the network. In 2011, it was announced that X-Men director Bryan Singer would join the project as an executive producer, assisting in the overhaul.
So that was very exciting for me to work with him because he did comic book movies before anybody was doing comic book movies.
Fuller and Singer agreed that while this new show should respect the characters and lore, they also needed to make them feel a bit more grounded and modern. NBC loved this new take and ordered a pilot to be directed by Singer in November 2011. Early concept art by John Gallagher suggests that the initial character designs were to be far more horrific than how they ended up looking. It's also worth mentioning that up to this point in its development, the show was still to be titled The Munsters. Fuller became inspired by ABC's Once Upon a Time, which premiered that year. He hoped that his Munsters show would be an equivalent for NBC, using Universal's back catalog of classic monsters, much in the way Once Upon a Time used Disney's back catalog of fairy tale characters.
I want to see the Invisible Man, I want to see the Creature from the Black Lagoon, I want to see all those characters come visit the show.
And are we going to see them?
Yes, that is absolutely the plan. One of the coolest things about filming this project on the Universal lot was on the stages where we had Grandpa's Dungeon still stands the original Phantom of the Opera set.
Fuller reached his next hurdle with the series when trying to cast it, finding that many of the actors he wanted for the lead roles were daunted by the prospect of stepping into such iconic characters.
One must dig deep to come up with the right character.
A cast could not be assembled in time for the pilot season that fall, and NBC decided to postpone the project until later in the year. They used this time to once again overhaul the concept, altering the character designs further. This is ultimately where the Munsters started to become Mockingbird Lane.
That's the reason that we titled the show Mockingbird Lane. It's not necessarily a remake of the Munsters, it's a show that has been inspired by the Munsters.
The creative team felt that retitling the show gave them more artistic liberty and interpretation with these characters. As such, a cast began to take shape. Eddie Izzard was the first to join, having recently worked with Singer on the film Valkyrie in 2008.
Would you like to come in? Can you, of your own free will, rephrase that as a statement? Please come in? Don't mind if I do.
Fuller and Singer felt that whereas the original Grandpa had been based on Bela Lugosi's Dracula, this new version should be based on Gary Oldman's Dracula.
What we kind of did with our version is base our Dracula on Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
In this new version of the Munsters lore, Grandpa Munster, nicknamed D, was written to be the head of the family, the one pulling all the strings.
The family I see as my foot soldiers in my mission to destroy all humanity. It's a family show.
Though envisioned as more of a monstrous version of the character, Fuller still wanted Grandpa to have a sense of humor, something that Eddie really brings to the role.
What is that?
My son-in-law would forget his head if it wasn't sewn on. It's a thing.
Mockingbird Lane also reinvented Herman's origins, as here it's written that Grandpa created Herman as a suitor for Lily.
I don't know what you're waiting for. It's not as if a brand new house is going to drop out of the skies, is it?
Jerry O'Connell was then cast as Herman. This new version of the character drew more inspiration from The Walking Dead than the classic Frankenstein's monster.
The sweet thing about Herman is he is a character who is in a constant state of decay, married to a woman who doesn't age, so that has a certain amount of insecurities that go with that territory.
Aside from a few visible scars, the character would be depicted as otherwise very human-looking, though on the inside he would be in a constant state of decay, continually needing new body parts and upgrades.
While it is an homage to the original, I think it's going to be very enjoyable for people who don't know the original.
Portia de Rossi was cast as Lily, who this time had far more vampiric powers than in the original show, though she was against using them to manipulate humans, unlike her father.
The thing Grandpa wants you to know about the circle of life is that he happens to be standing outside of it.
English actress Charity Wakefield would portray Marilyn, probably the only character to replicate the look of their 1960s counterpart, though her personality was a lot darker this time.
Miss, there may be dead homeless people in the walls.
Then they found a home after all.
Probably the most inspired take on a family member would be Eddie Munster, who in this version is initially unaware that he is a werewolf, and the pilot deals with the family's reluctance to inform him of his heritage.
I wouldn't change a hair on your body, no matter where they may grow.
Are we having that conversation? I know all about puberty.
You see, he knows all about puberty.
This was also written to be the reason that the Munsters moved into a new home at Mockingbird Lane, as the show opens with Eddie's attack on his wildlife explorers group on a camping trip, forcing the family to relocate.
Moving away is a form of goodbye.
Not really. Did Grandpa try to eat somebody again? Is that why we had to leave?
No, not Grandpa.
The pilot ends with Eddie being made aware of his gift, and his parents giving him Spot as a present. Eddie's original actor, Butch Patrick, though initially critical of the concept, later visited the set and endorsed the project. Fuller had plans for him to take on a recurring role as a scoutmaster, though those plans never materialized.
If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say.
The pilot was shot in July 2012, with NBC going all out in the design of the sets, makeup, and effects. It's rumored that the pilot cost $10 million when all was said and done.
As the hipsters say, that's quite a bag full of bread.
Perhaps seeing that the ends didn't justify the means, by September, NBC had decided to officially pass on the project once and for all.
In other words, my boy, your pilot light has gone out.
In a unique turn of events, however, they chose to air the pilot as part of a special Halloween presentation on October 26, 2012.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Some hoped that this meant more episodes would be ordered if the pilot performed well, but the network had no plans to produce more episodes, airing the pilot more as a way to recoup costs than gauge interest.
It's probably about the Money.
Speaking with The Hollywood Reporter, then NBC president Bob Greenblatt said, "We just decided that it didn't hold together well enough to yield a series. It looked beautiful and original and creative, but it just ultimately didn't come together. I just think we didn't get the mix right." And this is something I have to strongly agree with. Watching this pilot today, I'm shocked by how much I enjoyed it. Maybe it's because I've suffered through so many cheap imitations of these characters when looking at all of these Munsters adaptations, but I really respect everything new that Fuller tried to do here.
The strangest thing about grieving is realizing the loved one's death really isn't that big of a deal.
Why would you say that to me?
Keeping just enough of the silliness of the original concept while trying to apply it to a more grounded reality was a really unique take. I like how there's still humor in the characters, less in a sitcom way, and more in a twisted dark comedy way.
Stephen, it's not as if Wendy Jo's gonna crawl up out of the grave and stop you from loving and being loved.
She was cremated. And entombed.
Old school, eh?
Ultimately, though, I feel like the main reason this concept didn't work is because the Munsters just didn't feel like, well, the Munsters.
All of those characters did their versions of the show. We're not going to try to do Fred Gwynn because we can't out Fred Gwynn. So we're doing something a little bit different.
I know I just praised the show for being different, but I think there was a way to take the classic characters and ground them in the present day without making them feel so unlike their original versions. I mean, look at those two Addams Family movies from the 90s, which effortlessly brought those characters into the present while still respecting their look and design. Raul Julia's Gomez doesn't feel like John Astin's Gomez, but you can recognize the influence of the latter on the former. As different as the portrayals are, they still capture the look and feel of Gomez Addams. Here, Fuller and Singer expected they could capture the essence of the Munsters without capturing their look, and it just doesn't come together in the way that they hoped. I mean, so much of what makes the Munsters iconic is how they look. It just simply can't be avoided. Again, I'm not saying that Jerry O'Connell should have been doing a Fred Gwynn impression here, but there was a way to respect the original design of the characters without being so polarizing.
It's just the way I told you. Those shows on television about horrible families have a definite effect on children.
It was recently announced that NBC is yet again attempting to reimagine the Munsters in a new, dark, gritty way. I would love an adult, dark take on the characters that still respects their comic essence. Something like What We Do in the Shadows, but with the Munsters.
Oh, I'm watching my little granddaughter for the night.
What a lovely little nibble she would be.
I'm sorry, do I know you?
That show succeeds so well because it depicts the main characters as real monsters, and that's where the comedy comes from.
Why would you walk home when you could turn into a bat? Bat!
Regardless, Mockingbird Lane at least deserves credit for trying something new, even if it didn't ultimately work out.